Welcome back. This is our final review lecture on linguistic structures, and it'll focus on some aspects of morphology and syntax. We're going to focus specifically on some areas that are going to be most relevant for us throughout the class. So we're not going to really spend a lot of time on morphology and syntax, but really focus in on some of the aspects that are going to be most useful for us. So those topics we'll cover are classifying different kinds of morphemes, so thinking about roots and affixes, those kinds of things. We'll focus in on certain kinds of morphemes, specifically gender and case, because those are going to be very important for us as we dive into the history of English and look at how we had these different morphemes and how those have sort of changed over time, and we've sort of lost some of that in our morphology, and how syntax has picked up the pieces for that. We'll look at some transitivity, which is related more to syntactic structures and sentences, and then just talk a little bit more about syntactic structures in general. So when we think about morphology, this is briefly just the study of morphemes, and morphemes are the smallest unit of meaning in a language. This is the first level of linguistic structure where we start linking form and function together. So if we have a plural marker s, and we compare that with just an S sound in a language, S doesn't mean anything in English. But if we add it to a word like cat and we say cats, now it means something because it's associated with the plural, but it doesn't mean anything until we've attached it to that word. But we do have that combination of the form it takes, S, and the function that it's performing, which would be plural. So when we're classifying morphemes, we have a few different ways of doing this. The first big description or distinction would be whether something is a root or whether something is an affix. So roots hold the main meaning of a word, the main meaning of what's happening. And then affixes get attached to the roots. So sometimes in some languages, roots can be either bound or free. And that is the other main distinction. So if something is free, it means it can stand by itself. We don't have to add any affixes to it for it to be grammatically correct. And many of our roots in English are free roots. So cat can stand by itself. I don't have to add anything to it for it to be a word that makes sense. If something is bound, this means that it has to have something attached to it for it to have the meaning that it has. So in modern English, most of our roots are free, but not quite all. And so things like whelm or ept or cran, as in cranberry, are bound roots. They can't stand by themselves. We have to add something to them before we actually have a complete word. In Old English, though, most of our roots were actually bound. We had to add different sort of grammatical pieces to them that we now do with syntax, but used to do with morphology and with different affixes. Affixes, by definition, have to be bound. They can't stand by themselves and hold meaning because they're attaching to something in order to have that meaning. So roots can be either free or bound, depending on if they can stand by themselves, but affixes will always be bound. They're always attaching to something in order for their meaning to be understood. So we'll spend a little bit more time thinking about some of these types of affixes, since they're going to be very important for us as we're going through the different levels of English and the different phases of English throughout history. So when we're thinking about affixes, there's two ways to classify them. So one of them is just based on the form that they take. What do they look like? So based on form, we have four different kinds of affixes. We can have a prefix, something that happens before a root. So the un in unhappy would be one of those examples. We can have a suffix, something that comes after the root. So the al ending in something like national. We can have an infix. This is not something we really see in English, aside from in occasional slang examples. So something like using swear words in something like fan-fucking-tastic would be an infix because we're putting it directly in the middle of the root itself. And then the last one, which we used to have in English and what we see in German languages, but that we no longer have in modern day English, is what's known as a circumfix. So the past participle in German is an example of this, where you have g and you have t, and it looks like a prefix and a suffix, but you need both parts put together onto a root in order for it to actually make sense. And then in terms of the kinds of function that affixes have, they have two-way kinds of function, and these are very important in thinking about what affixes are doing when they're attaching to different roots. So in terms of function, you can have inflectional affixes. These are things that refine or give additional grammatical information. And these are things that are typically required grammatically. They need to be there in order for the sentence to make sense. And these are usually very productive. We can use them in many situations. In some cases, we have to use them in all situations. So if you have something like a case marker that goes on nouns, you would have to put them on all of the nouns of the kind of category you're using them for. And so these would be very productive kinds of morphemes. They're doing a lot of stuff across a lot of different words. And we see these relatively infrequently in English, in modern English, but much more frequently in older forms of English. In modern English, they occur after the other kinds of affixes that we have, the derivational ones, so they're always at the very, very end of a word. And they can only be suffixes in English. We don't have any inflectional prefixes. Derivational affixes are the other kind of function. And these ones change the meaning of the word, or they give you a new part of speech. So you can think of derivational as deriving something new. You're getting something different. These ones are not necessarily required by syntax. You can add them. They do something when you add them, but they're not required in order to have something grammatical. And because they tend to be used in more specific situations, they're not usually as productive. So our ness ending, as in something like friendliness, we can only really add it to certain kinds of words. We can't add it to just anything. Or hood, as in brotherhood or sisterhood, or neighborhood. We can really only add to a very specific kind of noun. So we don't see them used as often. And typically they're found attaching closer to the root than the inflectional affixes. And in English, we can have them as prefixes or as suffixes. So the un in unhappy changes the meaning of happy to sad, or something that's the opposite of happy. So it's changing the core meaning. So you can see prefixes doing this as well. So in modern English, all of our prefixes are derivational, but our suffixes could be either inflectional or derivational. And when we're thinking about morphemes more broadly, when we're thinking about words as they're put together, we also want to think about what they're doing in terms of their relationship in a sentence. So morphology and syntax do often work very hand in hand, and we'll see a lot of that crossover throughout the semester as well. So morphemes in words will fall into two categories. They're either going to be content or they're going to be functional. So content morphemes are things that have semantic content to them. So they have some sort of more easily defined kind of dictionary definition. They tend to be a little bit more tangible. And there are things like derivational morphemes that are going to be content morphemes as well, because they're contributing some sort of change in meaning to whatever you're adding them to. And most of our free morphemes are content morphemes as well, especially in word classes that are seen as open classes. So these are things like nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, are things that would be content words and easily changed and easily added into our lexicon. Functional morphemes, however, tend to provide information that's more about the relationship between the different content words, the content morphemes in a sentence. So it's more about the grammatical function that's happening in relating these different words to each other than their own individual meanings. So inflectional morphemes are always functional. They're always giving us some sort of grammatical understanding. Many of the functional morphemes can also be free, especially things that are certain kinds of words like prepositions, articles, pronouns, conjunctions in modern day English. Some of these were done using different kinds of morphemes in older forms of English, but those different kinds of word classes can be free and also still functional in nature. And they tend to resist being changed or added to the lexicon. They tend to be more closed class because these are often things that are native that we've had for a much longer period of time. They don't really change as much because their usage is not to have any sort of sense of specific meaning, but more a relationship between things. So in English, things like determiners, pronouns, prepositions, conjunctions, helping verbs tend to be these closed class functional style of words. So if we look at our modern English sense of morphemes, and we look at this sort of chart here, we have morphemes that are either going to be bound or they're going to be free. Free morphemes can then either be open class or closed class. Our open class ones in English are nouns, adjectives, verbs, and adverbs. Our closed classes are things like conjunctions, prepositions, articles, pronouns, auxiliary verbs, those kinds of things. If something is bound, then it can either be a root or an affix. And the roots are very limited in English. So things like sieve or mit, so conceive, commit, those kinds of things are words that are roots that are bound because they contain the main information, but they can't stand by themselves. Affixes then have those other breakdowns. And the most important breakdown would be things like, is it derivational? Am I getting something new? Or is it inflectional? So in modern English, inflectional ones are always suffixes. We only have a handful of them. Derivational ones can be either prefixes or suffixes, and they'll do something to change the meaning of the word or change the class of the word. So taking something from an adjective to a noun, for instance, would be an example of changing the word class. if we hone in on a couple of specific types of morphemes, things that are going to be very useful for us to understand throughout the semester, the first one we'll talk about is gender. And gender is a classification that's added to nouns. These are known as nominal words. And there's two different ways to understand gender in language. There can be grammatical gender or there can be social gender. And these are very different, and they play very different roles in how things are interpreted and how a language functions. So a grammatical gender is something that's applied to every single noun no matter what. All nouns will have some sort of gender added to them, and they'll fall into some sort of category regardless of any sort of social gender role. So even things that we wouldn't socially give gender to have some sort of grammatical association. Germanic languages typically have three genders. There's a masculine, a feminine, and a neuter. And then the older forms of English also had this gender system as well. So this is something that we're going to see a lot of examples of, especially in older forms of English. This is in comparison with something like social gender, which is what we now have in modern day English, where only words that are associated with a particular social construction of gender have markers that specify gender. So we see this in our pronoun system. Things like he or she or they are different ways that we associate certain constructs of social gender to different words. And the way that we're doing that is typically done through things like pronouns. We don't have a lot of markers for that otherwise anymore. If we look at some examples of what grammatical gender can look like in other Germanic languages, if we look at this example from Norwegian, you'll notice that they make distinctions for gender that are also masculine, feminine, and neuter. But then you notice there are differences also whether something is definite or indefinite. They have a double definite, which would be something like that instead of the. And then they also are putting these different gendered markers in that are including things like adjectives and possession as well. And we'll see a lot of these examples in older forms of English also. But you'll notice that the markers will sometimes look similar. So the masculine ones, you see that N very frequently that's going through. The feminine ones, you have A, you have A, den, A, fin, me. Some slightly different ones than what you see in the masculine column. The neuter ones seem to often end in a T, and so even if they're slightly different, oftentimes the variations that you see will have some sort of thing that sort of falls into place as a similarity between them. But you can see that there's many different ways that these get marked onto the words, and then you don't have to actually say something like the horse. If you say hästen, that would be the horse. It's already marked on there that it's a definite thing. So that would translate in English, in modern English, to the horse, but it would just be one single word in Norwegian. The other important morpheme type that we need to talk about and that we'll see a lot of as we move through the semester is what I've already mentioned as case. Case is something that is also added to nouns, and this is an important morpheme type because it identifies what the syntactic relationship is between nouns and verbs in a sentence. So nouns can be marked for case to show the kind of relationship that there is. We have very, very little of this left in modern day English. Though really the only things that we see are in subject and object pronouns, so he versus his. So he would be a subject pronoun. Him, would be the object pronoun, so we use different pronouns in subject or object position. And things like possession, so that apostrophe S is a possession marker that stems from our case system. This is known as a genitive case to show possession. So we see a little bit of this left in modern English, but not very much. Older forms of English had a much more robust case system that we'll see as we start looking through those different areas. And case is something that allows a lot of languages to have a lot more freedom of their word order because the relationship between the different pieces of the sentence is already marked in the nouns. So you don't have to stick with a specific order of words like we have in modern day English because you already have that relationship. You already have a marker that says this is the subject. You have a marker that says this is the object. You have a marker that says this is possessed. And so they can move around in the sentence and they already have that relationship, so you already know. The most common cases that we'll see, and the ones that tend to hold through longer in English, are things like nominative case, so our subjects, accusative, which would be an object or more specifically a direct object, dative cases or indirect objects, and then genitive markers for possession. We'll spend a lot more time in the next unit diving into these different cases and looking at examples of them more. Verbs are not more marked for case, but they can sort of demand that certain nouns tend to accompany them. So what is required on verbs and what is required for nouns to come with those verbs is due to things like transitivity, which we'll talk about in a moment. So another example of grammatical case shows that there can be different kinds of ways that this tends to mark itself in a word, and also how often it tends to mark itself. So in modern day German, for instance, if you look at the case markers, you're noticing that most of the changes are happening in the different articles, the things that are coming in front. So der, des, dem, den are the ones that you're noticing in the German example, where there's not a lot of specific morphemes that are also added any longer. Icelandic, on the other hand, has them in their order that comes directly after their root, but you're seeing them happening in front of other suffixes as well, but they have a much more robust list of them for these things like nominative, genitive, dative, accusative. To get into transitivity and relate that to case, we're getting a little bit more into some of that last bit of syntax that we'll be talking about. Transitivity is what's required by a verb. And so if you remember this from grade school, transitivity requires things that are based on what the verb needs. So in English, an intransitive verb will only require a subject. So in English, we have to have a subject with any verb. Some languages, you can have a marker that's on the verb itself, and it doesn't necessarily mean you have to have a separate subject. In English, all of our verbs require a subject. So even intransitive verbs will have a subject, but that's the only thing that's required. So a sentence like she sleeps is perfectly fine. She is the subject, so this would be a nominative case in English. And we would have that coming before the verb because that's the ordering that we have to have in modern day English. When we get into other kinds of transitivity, we start requiring additional elements in the sentence. So a transitive verb will require a subject and an object. So we have a subject, our nominative case, and then we also have a direct object, which would be the accusative case. So you notice that the pronouns are different. She sees him. We know that she has to be the subject because we're using a nominative pronoun. We know that him has to be the object because we're saying him and not he. And if we switch those around, we would be changing the pronouns also. He sees her would be the changing of meaning, but we change the pronouns also because they're in a different case role. And so these are marked for case still in modern day English. And because of that, we can move the words around a little bit and it still makes sense. So if I say she sees him versus it's him she sees, it still means the same thing because we know that those pronouns have certain associations. And then finally, the kinds of requirements for ditransitive verbs are verbs that require a subject and two objects. So this would be things that are coming with verbs like give, which is a frequent ditransitive verb in many languages. So she gave him to her would be an example of a ditransitive verb where you have your subject and then you have your direct object. So him is what's being given. And then you have the indirect object, which would be the dative case, which would be to her. In modern English, we put all of our objects into the same case. We don't really distinguish between accusative and dative with any sort of morphology, but we do have a default syntax order for this. So in our default ordering in English, we would have our subject and then our verb and then the direct object, and then we would put the indirect object into a prepositional phrase. So the indirect object would go after that preposition. And the preposition indicates that it's the dative case now. Because we don't have those case markings, we use these other syntactic aspects to do it instead. And then finally, just to get us thinking about a little bit of syntax structure, as we'll see a lot of this happening in many of our examples throughout the semester, syntax is just broadly the study of word order, how words are put together in larger units. So a lot of those other aspects of things like case, things like transitivity, things like these different morphemes that are marking different relationships are related to syntax as well. And the syntactic rules that we'll see are similarly to phonology, also language specific. So different languages are going to have different kinds of default orders of the ways that they put words together. So word order just in general, we can have subjects, verbs, objects as a general pattern of ways that we put things together. Can vary from language to language. So in modern English, we're a language that puts our subject first, and then our verb, and then our object. So Pat hit Alex. But in a language like Basque, they would have the subject, and then they would put the object, and then the verb would go at the end. So the translation would be word for word, something like Pat, Alex hit. And it would mean the exact same thing. And then you can have a language like Welsh, which has the verb at the very beginning. This is much less common than those other two. And then you would have the subject, and then you would have the verb. So it would translate into something like hit, Pat, Alex. And it would mean the exact same thing as our modern English, Pat hit Alex. How we put different phrases together and how we put words together into units within a sentence is also something that changes from language to language. So in modern English, we start with a determiner and then an adjective and then a noun in a noun phrase. So we would say the large house. But in a language like Spanish, the noun would go in the middle and we'd have determiners before, adjectives afterwards. Or in a language like Indonesian, they would put the noun at the very beginning, and then you get the adjective, and then you get the determiner. And so different languages are going to have different sort of rules governing the order of the things that end up happening within those. And we'll see lots of examples of that throughout the semester. So as always, any questions you have, please send me an email, schedule some office hours and talk to me, or bring questions to class so we can discuss them all together. Have a good one.